Biology in the soil is crucial, foundational. So I will be demonstrating how I've built up the biology in the soil through culturing IMO, Indigenous Micro Organisms, and really building the topsoil, doing inoculations and mulches. I'm going to demonstrate different mulching techniques, from sheet mulching to occultation and solarization techniques as well, cover cropping. These are all methods that we can use. No one method is better than the other. It really depends on the situation that you're facing. So for me, whenever I am consulting a farm, it really takes a lot of observation really before I make any decision on how I'm going to move forward on that farm. It takes a lot of preparation, observation, and analysis of what materials and resources that we have on the farm. Which brings me to another point. Another real fundamental principle of natural farming is sourcing locally, using our natural resources that we have. We could do an organic style of farming that was pulling in different imports that might be organic, but where was that trucked in from? How many hundreds of thousands of miles did that have to travel from some mine using petroleum, using energy to get it there? So keeping this in mind, really localizing our inputs and fertilizers is another big aspect of natural farming. JADAM teaches us how to use herbs as natural pesticides as well, IPM in the garden. So we always want to look for those resources that we have available directly around us. And we also want to see how our practices are affecting the local landscape, how our system is playing into the bigger systems that exist in and around us as well. And we want to work within a harmony, a symbiosis within those systems as much as we can. So it's winter time here in the food forest, and one way that we can emulate nature in the garden during the winter time is to see and observe how these deciduous trees are all dropping their leaves to the ground, forming a natural mulch layer, which in turn is being broken down with the help of microorganisms in the soil. That's turning into a humus and a natural compost that's being nutrient cycled back into the soil and becoming nutrients for those trees and plants. So acknowledging that process, we can now emulate that in our gardens by adding our compost, our inputs, our mulches, and our inoculations during these winter months, well ahead of time before we're ready to plant, so that we're giving time for that living soil to develop, that nutrient cycling system to start functioning. So living soil takes time to develop. It's not an overnight instant gratification type of farming. This will take time to develop, to find that equilibrium and balance, just like anything that we see in nature. Any ecosystem took time to get all of those elements, all of that life really balanced, and that nutrient cycling process happening. There's going to be more inputs up front when you're developing a living soil system, and those outputs will happen more and more over the years. They will increase with less and less inputs as that living soil develops. So this is a feedback loop that we're creating, and again, we're going to use more inputs on the front end of that, and as we really get that perpetual cycle going, mimicking nature, those systems will start self-regulating on their own with minimal inputs to keep them going, and those outputs will become greater and greater. This is why I think on a commercial level, it can be really challenging for some to see the benefits of living soil as it takes time to develop. For those that see the true value in natural farming, this living soil gets better and better and better and better with years to come. Unlike conventional farming with salt-based fertilizers that bioaccumulate in the soil and literally deplete and kill the biology in the soil, which in turn will create all kinds of problems. So looking towards nature, we can really glean great inspiration and ingenuity in our system's approach to our design, how these design elements on a farm are functioning together to create something much greater. So with anything in life, it's important to have both theory and practice. This is a double-edged sword. If we have all theory, then all we have is conjecture in this ethereal realm that is never rooted into anything tangible, anything physical in this three-dimensional world. And if we only have practice, then we're aimlessly wandering through treacherous terrain. So both are very important. Our theory, our philosophy, our hypotheses. We need to root that into our practice. And from there, it's always a oscillation between the two. Having an approach, a theory, again, a hypothesis that we put to the test in this physical world. And we take what works and we take what doesn't work, and we come back to the drawing board and we distill our approach down to better ways of application and practicing what we do. And on that point of theory and practice, I would now like to step off my soapbox of theory and philosophy and get to the practice.
Sheet mulching is an excellent technique for suppressing out grasses and weeds where we are trying to plant a new garden without using any kind of tillage, any kind of machinery, and disturbing the earth, while creating a protective layer for microorganisms below the subsurface and building soil. Here I am brewing a batch of JMS-JADAM Microbial Solution. Bubbles have risen to the surface here. This is at its prime. And this makes a really great inoculant to soak our cardboard when we're first putting down the cardboard for our sheet mulching. So I use that at a dilution of 1 to 100 when I'm soaking in cardboard. And this is a really important step. The cardboard will take time to kind of break down, and we need to soak that in really well with our inoculant and water. So it really is crucial in the beginning stages of putting the cardboard down to really soak it in thoroughly. Otherwise, the cardboard, it's not going to really break down. And the whole point is that we create a protective layer for the microorganisms below the surface. So here we can see cardboard that's been sitting outside for a month or so. And below we can see a lot of mycelium here, a lot of fungal growth. And this is great. This is what we want to see when we're building soil. We want to see a lot of fungal inoculation and fungal activity happening. This is what's going to help build the topsoil and develop symbiotic relationships with our plants. You can see that the grasses and weeds under the cardboard have also decomposed. So that's available nutrients now being recycled back into the topsoil, and really food for the microbes and the plants. So for the second mulch layer, I like to use straw. This is a great way to hold down the cardboard, which often I've heard a complaint about winds blowing away the cardboard. And I'll say that on this application we had absolutely no problem with that, and this is a very high wind zone. So the straw can really help to hold down the cardboard and help with the aesthetics as well. So here you can see 2 lines of blueberries that were staggered for our lowest horizon of the shrubbery layer. We also transplanted trees about every 10 feet in the middle of this bed. And finally, what I'm doing is just soaking down all the straw on top of the cardboard to settle everything down and make sure we keep it nice and moist. And for the final layer of mulch, what I like to use is charged wood chips for the top layer. Now, you could just go with your straw if that's all you had, but I do like to add in that third layer of charged wood chips. It's really important to compost or charge, there's a few terms for this, your wood chips, because if you use fresh wood chips that have not been processed, essentially you're adding a sponge out to the top of your soil that can leach out nutrients and minerals that can really rob your plants. So look for a video on the process of charging your wood chips on my Rogue Natural Farming YouTube channel. And it's not that dissimilar to charging biochar, which I also have a video for. So here we can see the spacing of our trees at 10 feet, and staggered between there we have shrubs every 5 feet for the lower shrub canopy and a ground cover of squash here. So a composting method that I've come to really love is a very hands-off compost technique, which is a passive, some might call it a static compost pile. I like to call this my earth chalice. You can see it's produced some fine compost here over a matter of about 2 months. And unlike other composting methods, the passive compost really doesn't require any rigorous turning or extra labor to produce this. Here you can see 3 months prior, this is all kitchen scraps. Here I'm dumping solid potatoes from a JMS batch that I made. So these are great to use in this compost. And I'm just layering in cardboard, as you can see. And here I'm using some of the curds left over from lactic acid bacteria, also a fine addition to this compost. And again, here we have the finished compost full of red wigglers. They did a great job, and they're also adding their humic fulvic acids to make an amazing compost for the garden. This is my worm tower, and I add these worms to the compost here as well. So they really help to break down all the food scraps. So the worm hotel is also a great place to keep my worm colonies alive. So I will add food scraps to that to keep them happy, as well as the right proportion of cardboard. And at the bottom you can see the leachates here, which are full of humic fulvic acids and a great addition to a compost tea. So like any style of compost, it's important to get your carbon-nitrogen ratio right. Now, anywhere between 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen is the ratio you want to be working with. And for my carbon source, I'm using cardboard and leaf mold from the forest. For more information on the Earth Chalice Pit, see my YouTube channel for an exclusive video. So here I'm top dressing with compost that was made in the earth chalice, feeding a freshly planted fruit tree. Now with fruit trees, or any trees for that matter, typically what you want to do is feed around the drip zone, which is the furthest point that the branches reach. That radius there is going to be the same radius that your feeder roots are reaching for nutrients. So now we're going to take a look just below the surface in this mulch layer of wood chips, and what we can see is a visible growth of mycelium. This is exactly what we want to see, this white web of fungal growth. And this is essentially helping to break down all organic matter into available nutrients, as well as spreading across to form connections and relationships with plants and create symbiotic connections. One way that I like to seed a lot of mycelium into a garden or a food forest is if I find a pile of wood chips or great topsoil somewhere out in the wild, I'll generally take samples of that I can take back and throw around in the garden to help seed. Here I have some local organic used coffee grounds from a local roaster in town. And really this is the only resource that I pick up from off of the farm. Everything else is really sourced and created here right on site of the food forest. This is the only input that I collect in town. It's a free resource that I have access to. So this is the only area of the food forest that I'm top dressing with coffee grounds. This is the citrus area also where the blueberries are planted very intentionally because they both love acidic soil, and coffee is very acidic. So Keep that in mind when you're using coffee grounds. The acidity can play a big factor. Top dressing with these coffee grounds really helps to buffer the pH and bring it down to an acidic level that the blueberries and citrus really love. You see a real response from the coffee grounds. The only other place I use them is in the compost pit, but be careful not to overdo it. So occultation and solarization, two terms for the same thing, essentially pulling tarps and suppressing out weeds below, has become a technique that I really love. It's a technique that does require some time though. You're going to need a month to 2 months, sometimes even 3, depending on how many weeds and how tenacious those weeds are and how well they're established. I've done this on big pasture fields in Oregon where we were transitioning a field from one crop to another, and it works great. As the weeds below are suppressed and die, they're decomposed into available nutrients that are cycled back into the topsoil to feed the microorganisms. So here I've used post piers to hold down the tarps to make sure winds will not blow them away for the duration they're needed. 3 months later, you can see this area now planted. We grew squash, corn, eggplant, tomatillos, and some tiger melons that did great with minimal fertilizers. So here we have another section that we used occultation with tarps to cover this area. So as you can see, all the weeds that were here, which were very tenacious, some of them very well established, are now reduced to essentially dead piles of biomass. All those nutrients have been decomposed and cycled back into the topsoil here. There are visible signs of mycelial growth, and the ground feels much softer. We are easily able to plant into this area now. If we're not able to use occultation and some of the other methods of sheet mulching and buy ourselves time to get planted faster, we can essentially weed out a zone, and with those quote-unquote weeds, we can make ourselves JADAM liquid fertilizer, also known as JLF. It's a very simple fertilizer to make, and essentially what we can do is just gather up all of those weeds that we've now ripped out of this raised bed here, and I'm basically just tossing them in a bucket of water, this pickle barrel over here. After about a month sitting in the bucket of water, we will have ourselves some fertilizer ready to use. Now, depending upon how hardy that plant is that we're using, that biomass, we might need more like 3 months. And what I'll do is keep a perpetual cycle of fertilizer going. I can use some of this fertilizer at will, and then I'll continue to add biomass back to that barrel and just continue this process of putrefaction. One of my favorite JADAM liquid fertilizers to make is with a plant called purslane, which is an amazingly nutrient-dense succulent that is very easy to grow, and it'll actually liquefy in water in a matter of 2 weeks. You can have yourself ready-made liquid fertilizer. Thistle is a great choice to make liquid fertilizer because it's widely available, and it's also a dynamic accumulator, which is a permaculture term meaning it's very nutrient dense, full of minerals and elements. Any green matter or nitrogen rich material will do for a liquid fertilizer, but best practice is always to use what you have at your fingertips. Indigenous microorganisms number 3 is a traditional Korean natural farming technique for first culturing localized indigenous microorganisms from a healthy forest or ecosystem nearby your farm. Secondly, saving them and preserving them in a sugar that is shelf stable. And third, propagating them out on a grain substrate. This mesophilic style of composting is an aerobic culture that can now be inoculated into garden beds. Here we can see a pile of IMO3 stored in a hoop house, sheltered from the elements in wintertime. So here you can see a piece of charged biochar in this IMO3. I'm a huge fan of biochar and all its many applications, and you can find further videos on how to make biochar and how to charge biochar
on my YouTube channel.
As I always like to say, biochar truly is the gift that keeps on giving. It will continue to remain in the soil for decades and sometimes even longer. So here I'm casting out IMO3 onto a garden bed that I have prepped for transplanting. I have some peppers here getting ready to transplant. And typically this is the time we want to apply IMO3 or 4 if we have it. Generally, the ratio here would be 330 pounds per quarter acre. However, I don't get too technical when I'm transplanting. I like to just cast it out and make sure we really spread it around nicely. You can also put it in the hole of your transplant as well to establish that contact with the roots. So if you haven't noticed by now, I'm using a multidisciplinary approach to my practice here. And this isn't to complicate things. It's more so really just to have a plethora of tools in our tool bag to use when we need them. As I mentioned earlier, this here is more of a traditional Korean natural farming approach. If you were to use JADAM for transplanting, you can also use the JMS-JADAM Microbial Solution as well, like I was using on my tree transplants. So one thing to keep in mind with traditional farming, KNF from Korea, versus JADAM, the newer generation of farming from Korea, is that the approaches are different in the sense that culturing IMO is more of an aerobic process, whereas culturing JMS, JADAM Microbial Solution, is going to be more of an anaerobic process. So the way that I like to use these two together is that I will use the JMS-JADAM method for using the deeper soil cultures, the deeper soil horizons that are more of an anaerobic zone. So these facultative microbes that are more of a density in JADAM Microbial Solution, they are better in those deeper soil horizons, whereas the IMO, which is much more of a fungal aerobic dominant culture, is better used in the top 5 inches of the topsoil, specifically for the root zone of transplanting. So obviously some plants actually prefer a bacterial dominant culture in the soil, like brassicas for instance, so you might just want to use JMS instead of the IMO culture for that application. So here after transplanting, I'm going to go ahead and mulch with straw. It's really important to always mulch with these indigenous microorganisms to protect them. And here I have a clover cover crop. This is a New Zealand white clover, which is a drought tolerant clover, less water thirsty than your Dutch white clover, and grows really close to the ground. It's also a great nitrogen fixer. So I like to do a light straw mulch along with a cover crop as well. This can also help outcompete opportunistic weeds. So here I'm applying the Thistle JLF, JADAM Liquid Fertilizer. This is the JLF we made earlier in the video. It sat for approximately 1 month, and you can really get an idea of the potency there from the pigments you see in that solution. It's quite dark. So typically I dilute down this JADAM Liquid Fertilizer to 1 part JLF to 30 parts water here. And this is the only fertilizer I used in these upper raised garden beds, which produce a nice bounty of rainbow carrots, golden beets, chard, kale, tomatoes, peppers, and plenty of golden berries as well. To truly be sustainable or regenerative on a farm, really we need to practice closing loops. So what is meant by closing loops? Just like in nature, one organism's waste is another's food source. So there's a nutrient cycling that is happening in nature. And if we can emulate this on our farm, then we are creating these loops and we are closing those loops and really creating these incredibly efficient, sustainable, and regenerative models for a farm that really emulate or mimic nature. The process of nutrient cycling is heavily dependent upon microorganisms. Whether that is an internal form of digestion in an animal, in a human being, or an external form of digestion in the soil, for example. Microorganisms are a key part of that nutrient cycling process. Grazing animals in a pasture or a farm is really a great way of adding that fertilizer, aka manure, back into the soil. Again, nutrient cycling and closing those loops on the farm. Furthermore, the KNF chicken coop is a deep litter system that generates an awesome top dress fertilizer. The fruiting bodies of fungi, aka mushrooms, are a sure sign of mycelium running across this food forest. So this is a great sign to see here. These fruit trees are producing the first year. Here we have some peaches amongst 50 other fruit trees that were planted this year and several berry shrubs as well. Here we have some plums. As well as some figs. This first year really being dedicated to planting those large sentinel trees, where in years to come we will fill in those gaps in between. As an herbalist, I really wanted to dedicate a special part of this food forest to perennial herbs, as I use them medicinally. And here we have some lemon balm, chamomile, valerian, sage, motherwort, mugwort, lady's mantle, angelica, aurelia, mullein, and many mints as well. The food forest emulates nature by using all the many levels that we see in a forest, from the high branches of the tallest trees down to the middle and dwarf trees, to the shrubs, to the herbaceous, to the ground covers, along with those climbers. This way we can maximize diversity and quantity of food and medicine grown in a given area, at the same time reducing the amount of labor necessary to produce that food and medicine. This, of course, is contrary to the way most of our food is grown in the industrial farming sector, using a monocrop across large acreage and really only taking advantage of lateral space, not the vertical space. Now, this is a topic of heavy debate, which I'm well aware of. The efficacy and scalability of the food forest model. For anybody who would like further research and somebody really showing that it can be done on large scales, I'd like to point people in the direction of Mark Shepard's work and his book, Restoration Agriculture.
Heading back to Cali with some bees. We got 5 nukes in here driving 199 back to the coast, back to Humboldt, but hopefully we can get the bees back. They're getting out at a rate that I've never seen before. Transportation of bees can be an art form in and of itself. This is my 5th season keeping bees, and I don't claim to be an expert by any means, but I learn more and more every year. I've also been practicing Korean natural farming for about 7 years now, and one thing I've come to learn is that Korean natural farming doesn't just apply to plants. It applies to animals, people, and really bees as well. What I've done is integrated Korean natural farming into my beekeeping practices. And I'm learning new ways of integrating these inputs, these IMOs, and this philosophy into the beekeeping system. I didn't learn any of this from Han-Kyu Cho. He did have a recipe for a bee feed water that was shared also for hummingbirds. However, none of these techniques were really gleaned from any teacher. They're all intuitive. And with keen observation and a willingness to listen to the bees, along with a lot of patience, I've learned a lot from the bees. I've had some good results experimenting with IMO, Indigenous Micro Organism cultures, as well as lactic acid bacteria cultures in and around the beehive. I'm absolutely convinced that KNF has applications for beekeeping, and I've been using these inputs and inoculants for that purpose. There's some great research done by Paul Stamets, the mycologist, who has found that the red-belted polypore can actually increase the lifespan of bees by 2 times. So there's definitely a connection between bees and fungi, as well as probiotic bacteria. And obviously a lot more research needs to be done in this area. In the broader context of the food forest, this apiary I've set up of 5 beehives really plays a role in the pollination of the crops so that we can get better yields from the crops and make sure that we get pollination amongst all of our fruit trees and vegetables as well as our herbs. So here I'm installing 5-frame nukes or nucleuses into a 10-frame Langstroth hive. Aside from what the bees have to forage on up here in the Northern California hills, I've also thrown out a wildflower bee-friendly mix to ensure they can make it through the season. Here I'm making a FPJ fermented plant juice. This consists of a dry sugar, which I always go organic, and a plant of choice. Only the tips, fruits, or buds are used. This is about the closest thing I can think of that bees would naturally forage on in the wild, especially if we were to use dehydrated honey, which I have used. I've fed my bees many kinds of fermented plant juices, and they really love a wide variety. But one of their absolute favorites I found here is the fennel. The fennel they just go crazy over. So it's one that I really love to feed the bees. There's no shortage of wild fennel in Northern California, and it's incredibly juicy. So it makes a great topping on your waffles as well. Tastes like a licorice candy. We can also influence the flavor profile of the honey based on those FPJs we're feeding the bees. These are the external hive feeders that I like to use in my hives, mainly because you can see the level of feed and know when it's time to refill. Looking inside here, you can see that the top of this lid has miniature holes and the FPJ drips down through slowly. and the bees can just crawl right into this little groove and feed off of that nectar. They slide right into the front entrance of the hive. So I am an avid fermenter and a mead maker, and I do harvest honey from my hives, but I'm also very conservative about how much honey I take from my hives. I always make sure that they have enough to make it through the winter, any given season. The other fermented honey drink I like to make is Jun here, and I also like to feed this to my bees as a probiotic. Traditionally, Jun is said to have come from high in the Himalayas, brewed by Buddhist monks. It's brewed with honey and green tea. However, you can brew it with any herbs you'd like. And I'm not trying to get the bees tipsy, so I do a low gravity batch of Jun just for them that is higher in the sugars and the honey, which they love anyways. And they also get that probiotic immune supportive benefit from the Jun as well. I'll be posting more videos on natural beekeeping, specifically the application of Korean natural farming in beekeeping in the future, so stay tuned.